Dive into the hidden tales of military history and tactics. Welcome to the Army Radar channel, where we uncover the epic battles of the past and the strategies of today, from the world wars to modern-day conflicts. We celebrate the valor of individual soldiers, explore covert operations, defense forces, and cutting-edge armaments. Join us on this thrilling journey.
June 6th, 1944. A date that has become forever ingrained in the minds of the Western world, as the day freedom began the long march toward the defeat of tyranny. Between 1939 and 1941, the forces of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany blazed a path of destruction, oppression, and murder across the map of Europe and beyond. And it seemed Hitler's ambition could never be satisfied. The world was his goal, death his tool. Only a badly beaten and desperately holding on Britain managed to stem the wound long enough to guarantee that all of Europe wouldn't be draped in the swastika. And yet within just 3 years, Britain, Canada, the United States, and many other allied nations would amalgamate into a single force, and in one swift move, drive a dagger into the side of Hitler's dreams of total European supremacy. That dagger was driven in on the beaches of Normandy, June 1944, and then twisted into a lethal wound that would never close. This is the story of Operation Overlord, the story of D-Day. As Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, a role abbreviated to the much less of a mouthful Cossack, it was down to British Army Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan to recommend an alternative. In a meeting with Allied leaders in Quebec, Canada in May of 1943, he gave his recommendation after tirelessly examining all the options available based on enemy disposition and the units and equipment that would be available to the Allies for the invasion. Quote, "I have come to the conclusion that, in view of the limitations in resources imposed by my directives, we may be assured of a reasonable chance of success on the 1st of May 1944 if we concentrate our efforts on an assault across the Norman beaches." It was, therefore, decided. When the Allies were ready and a date set, a day that would become known as D-Day, the Allied forces would invade Normandy. Germany's extraordinary success in 1940, which led to the fall of Western Europe under the German jackboot, was now a source of great concern for Hitler. For on the defensive, it presented him with an enormous coastline stretching from the north of Spain up into Scandinavia, from which his forces now had to defend against an Allied invasion. Perhaps conscious of the fact that his own forces had been successful against France by simply going around the seemingly impenetrable Maginot Line in 1940, he outlined a strategy of building powerful fortifications, supported by military and aircraft as far as was possible along this coastline, to prevent allies from breaching Fortress Europe. This also allowed him to keep as many of his troops as he could on the Eastern Front and in Italy, where, on both counts, he was in retreat by mid-1944. Dubbed the Atlantic Wall, the Germans built vast numbers of concrete bunkers along 4,000 miles of coastline, broken apart by natural obstacles, man-made ones, and numerous minefields. The Dieppe raid and numerous smaller operations conducted by British commandos only heightened Hitler's fears that he was exposed to invasion from the west, and he ordered the wall be given high priority. Yet, compared to other fronts, the troops based on the wall had a relatively quiet time between 1941 and 1944. However, even with troops from occupied countries filling their ranks, the Germans did not have enough men to defend the entire wall equally. In August of 1943, a new commander arrived on the Atlantic Wall that gave the Allies cause for concern. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, arrived to oversee the construction of defenses and formulate a plan of action with which to repel an Allied invasion. Despite his Africa Corps having been repelled from North Africa, he was still highly respected as a competent military leader in Allied circles. Construction of the Atlantic Wall had, before Rommel's arrival, ground down to an apathetic effort by the German officers. However, the Field Marshal's influence was immediately felt by his subordinates, who suddenly found themselves with vastly increased workloads. But as well as having to contend with resistance below him, Rommel was also contending with his increasing unpopularity with the German High Command. Some saw him as a failure following the defeat in North Africa, while others viewed him as a rival for influence with Hitler, while others still simply didn't like him. In outlining his plan to repel an Allied invasion, Rommel requested that German tank forces, spearheaded by infantry, be held close to the coastline to respond quickly to any Allied landings. Such powerful tank forces could devastate the infantry trying to wade ashore and prevent the establishment of an Allied beachhead from where fresh troops and tanks could be deployed. However, both Hitler and the German Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, were opposed to Rommel's request. They instead adopted the policy of grouping their tank forces together away from the coastline, so once the main Allied assault came, which they were still convinced would ultimately be from Calais, the panzers could be thrust against it and drive the Allies back into the sea. Nevertheless, Rommel remained committed to his duty to defend Germany's French prize as best he could. As well as the bunker construction effort, he also instigated an immense mining operation in and around the French coastline, and impressed upon his subordinates the importance of their work. Less than 2 months before D-Day, in April of 1944, he was inspecting one of countless French beaches he was tasked with defending, when he outlined to his adjutant, Captain Helmuth Lang, his view of the overall situation Germany found itself in at the time. Quote, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll only have one chance to stop the enemy, and that's while he's in the water. Believe me, Lang, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive for the Allies as well as Germany. It will be the longest day." The one factor that neither the Allies nor the Germans had any control over. Clear skies were needed for the full moon to help with the navigation during airborne operations, while the need for calm water in the seaborne phase was obvious. After listening to Stagg's case, Eisenhower reluctantly agreed, and he gave the order that the invasion was to be postponed until June 6th. Stagg would be proven correct when, on the night of June 4th and the morning of June 5th, the landing zones were lashed with terrible weather. Finally, as the weather began to improve, on June 5th, 1944, what had been the original date for D-Day, the preparation phase began, unaware that the dreams of a 1,000-year Reich were about to be shattered. First Lieutenant Robert P. Mathias of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment from the 82nd would attain the tragic accolade of being the first American to be killed on D-Day when the C-47 he was aboard was hit by anti-aircraft fire, mortally wounding him before he had a chance to jump with his men. In the chaos, many paratroopers missed their drop zones, often by miles, and the units that were landed were often in disarray. Despite these setbacks, the paratroopers fought fiercely against German forces behind the beaches at Normandy, destroying artillery guns, disrupting supply routes, and diverting German attention away from the landings. However, not all the members of the airborne units deployed that night went in under the canopies of parachutes. Many went in via gliders that would be towed to release points near their targets and then piloted down in what was effectively a controlled crash. Gliders had the advantage of being able to carry larger equipment for the airborne troops, but they came with a whole host of their own dangers too. They were just as vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire as their powered counterparts, and landing them safely was often a tricky undertaking that, if you got it wrong, could see as many troopers killed or injured before they even had a chance to fight. The British airspeed Horsa was capable of transporting up to 30 fully equipped troops or various light vehicles and field guns. Yet, despite its size and the lack of a power plant, it was a surprisingly agile aircraft in flight, given that it was highly unlikely that any significant number would survive their first flight into battle. The Horsa was manufactured using wood, which helped alleviate the strain on the supply chain for strategic metals. The Hammerklaw was another large glider, designed primarily to carry light tanks, 17-pounder field guns, or large numbers of supplies in a single flight. While an American design, it was fielded solely by the British and was designed around specifications outlined by Winston Churchill himself in 1941. It was, however, the Waco CG-4 that was the most numerically significant glider of the war. The CG-4, known as the Hadrian in British service, was smaller than the Horsa, only being able to carry either 13 combat-ready troops with equipment, a single jeep, or a single 75mm howitzer. But its smaller size gave it the advantage of being able to land in tighter areas, thus greatly expanding the number of potential landing sites. Featuring a welded tubular fuselage with canvas covering the wings, skinned in thin plywood, the CG-4 also had other advantages. The payload area, for example, was made more easily accessible thanks to the nose and cockpit being mounted on a hinge, allowing it to swing upwards, exposing the whole cargo area. Because of the often violent nature of glider landings, a safety cable was also fitted, designed to attach to any vehicle being carried inside the cargo area. Should the vehicle break free when the glider hit the ground and slide forward towards the cockpit, the cable would lift the hinged cockpit upwards to the unloading position, thus saving the pilots from being run over by their own cargo. The British 6th Airborne Division made extensive use of gliders in capturing the bridges over the River Orne and the Caen Canal. Taking the bridges relatively quickly, they then had to dig in and fight tooth and nail to keep them, until reinforcements could arrive. Of all the beaches on D-Day, the 10-mile stretch designated as Omaha was by far the most heavily defended, and thus the beach was hit by a force of heavy bombers prior to the landing taking place. However, the bombers had to contend with thick clouds blanketing the area, and so they had to effectively bomb blind. Concerned their weapons might stray out to sea and hit the Allied armada, the crews proved too cautious in their aiming, and many of the bombs missed their targets, falling instead inland on the French countryside. A particularly concerning obstacle for both US beaches was a gun battery located at Pointe du Hoc, a 100-foot tall cliff that provided a wide arc of fire over the surrounding areas, including the beaches where thousands of Americans would be landing in the early hours. Therefore, prior to the main force arriving, 225 men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, were given the unenviable task of scaling the cliffs with ropes and ladders in an effort to destroy the gun battery. The Rangers approached in 12 landing craft and 2 DUKW amphibious trucks, but took heavy fire as they neared the beach. One landing craft was lost, with all but one of its occupants. They then began placing the 100-foot-long ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade up against the cliffs and began to scale them, all the while still taking heavy enemy machine gun and mortar fire. With Allied warships providing fire support, the Rangers reached the top of the cliff, where they discovered that their intended targets, the field guns, had been moved. The Rangers eventually located the weapons, left unguarded in an orchard over half a kilometre to the south, and proceeded to destroy them. Their mission was accomplished, but now the Rangers had to contend with heavy combat with the Germans over the next 24 hours, until they would be relieved by additional reinforcements, by which time they'd suffered 77 men killed and 152 wounded. If the banks of well-protected German gunners were not enough, the beach was also protected by a wealth of obstacles, both natural and man-made, that the landing craft would have to navigate. A difficult job made worse by incredibly powerful winds that blew more than one flat-sided landing craft off course. At 630 hours, the first wave, comprising men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, made their landings amidst what must have seemed like an impenetrable wall of bullets. In the spaces between the landing craft and positions of some cover in front of the Germans, bodies of fallen US troops soon began to litter the sands, barbed wire and fixed obstacles slowing the American advance, allowing them to be sprayed by German machine guns. There was so much death on Omaha Beach in the opening rounds of the invasion that when landing craft were seen leaving the beach again, the Germans mistakenly told their commander, General Dietrich Kress, that the American troops had been driven off. Kress then ordered many of the troops guarding Omaha to relocate to fight off the British forces at Gold Beach. This was a major error, for the landing craft was simply returning back to the ships to pick up more US troops to throw at the German defences. Yet, despite this, even with the aid of combat engineers blasting away at fixed defences, warships providing fire support, and tanks being landed to support assaults against the defenders, the US troops failed to secure their beachhead and link up with the British forces from Gold Beach on D-Day itself. Instead, however, they managed to secure 2 strong points on the beach, from where over the following days they were able to offload men and supplies and finally clear out the German defenders, securing the beach and linking up with the Allied units from other beaches. A number of journalists accompanied the troops ashore to report on what they saw. Among them was a driven and determined young woman named Martha Gellhorn. Wife of author Ernest Hemingway, Gellhorn was not actually authorized to report on the landings, and so, in a rather daring move, stowed away aboard a hospital ship and then impersonated a stretcher bearer in order to join medical teams going ashore to retrieve the wounded. Given the chaos of the dramatic events that were unfolding around her, she was able to pull off this deception and become the only woman to land at Normandy on D-Day, allowing her to give a first-hand account of the scene. Her article, published in the Collier magazine, reads as following. Everyone was violently busy on that crowded, dangerous shore. The pebbles were the size of apples and feet deep, and we stumbled up a road that a huge road shovel was scooping out. We walked with the utmost care between the narrowly placed white tape lines that marked the mine-cleared path, and headed for a tent marked with a red cross. Everyone agreed that the beach was a stinker, and that it would be a great pleasure to get the hell out of here sometime. In planning for D-Day, Utah Beach was the last to be selected, and it extended over 11 miles of shoreline, making it the largest beach hit on June 6th. As the westernmost beach, the main aim of establishing a beachhead at Utah was to give the Allies a suitable location to prepare for an assault on the strategic harbour town of Cherbourg, some 35 miles away. Assaulting the beach was the US 7 Corps, who faced relatively light resistance when compared to the horrors of Omaha. The main German defensive position composed of a single powerful 88mm artillery piece, which was soon destroyed, and the German defenders manning it surrendered. Within 3 hours of the start of the assault, all three major entrances to the beach had been secured, permitting 20,000 troops and 1,700 vehicles to cross Utah Beach on D-Day. Among those fighting on Utah Beach was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the eldest son of former US President Theodore Roosevelt. Brigadier General Roosevelt was serving with the 4th Infantry Division when it stormed Utah Beach, going ashore with his men despite his rank and age. Being 56, he was the oldest Allied soldier at the front. Roosevelt took command of almost every aspect of his division's operations that day, allowing him to directly address the many problems that emerged. It was even reported that, in some instances, he directed trucks and tanks like a traffic cop, whilst personally taking enemy fire, all the while sharing poetry and amusing anecdotes with frightened soldiers under his command. For his gallantry, he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Tragically, however, just over a month later on July 12th, he passed away due to a heart attack. Afterwards, the recommendation was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the highest award in the United States for valor, which he was awarded posthumously. His citation read, quote, "Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brigadier General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strongpoints and rapidly moved inland, with minimum casualties. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France." Sandwiched between Omaha Beach to the west and Juneau to the east, Gold Beach was a 10-mile stretch of shoreline earmarked for assaults primarily by the British 50th Northumberland Infantry Division and the 47 Royal Marine Commando, and their primary objective was to capture the harbour town of Arromanches, which had been selected as an ideal site for the building of a mulberry harbour. Waiting for the British at Gold Beach were elements of the Wehrmacht's 716th Infantry Division, which included a large proportion of Osttruppen, Poles and Russians who had been conscripted to serve in the German army. Additionally, the beach was protected by a battery of 4 155mm guns, positioned around half a mile inland. The British went ashore 1 hour after the Americans hit Utah and Omaha, owing to the tide at Gold Beach. Unfortunately for the British, an unexpected northwest wind meant that many of the underwater obstacles and mines placed by the Germans remained submerged as the British landing craft began to storm the beach. Unable to identify all of them, the British force would suffer the loss of some 20 landing craft before they could get their troops and equipment to shore. Owing to the weather, the swimming Shermans had to be moved closer to shore before they could be put into the water, followed later by Churchill AVREs. But by midday, they were fully engaged in driving the Wehrmacht troops from their positions. However, they would continue to take heavy fire from artillery guns at the Le Hamel strongpoint until mid-afternoon, when the AVREs destroyed the fortification protecting them. By day's end, the British force had pushed inland, securing the beachhead and allowing construction of the Mulberry Pier to begin. But this came at the cost of 400 British casualties. At just 2 miles long, Juneau Beach was the smallest of the D-Day beaches, being positioned between Gold and Sword to the west and east respectively, and was the objective of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the Canadian 2nd Armoured Brigade, and the British No. 48 Commando. The beach's small size only served to exacerbate Allied planners' fears concerning a reef in the waters leading up to the beach, requiring landings to begin at 745 hours, when the tide was at its highest, reducing the risk to the landing craft. However, it turned out that it would not be nature's obstacles that would savage the Canadians, but instead the German mines littering the coastline. A horrifying 1/3 of all landing crafts struck mines as they advanced towards the beach, where the German 716th Infantry Division's 736th Regiment plus the 430th Ost Eastern Battalion, again comprised of Russians and Poles, were waiting for them. The defenders fought a bloody and brutal battle to drive the Canadians off the beach, but the Canadians stubbornly refused to let the beach turn into another Dieppe, and they kept the pressure up, eventually forcing the Germans to withdraw. By the end of the day, some 21,400 troops had landed at Juno, and the Canadians had pushed further inland than any from the D-Day landings, capturing an airfield at Carpiquet. However, it had cost the Canadians 946 casualties, of which 340 were killed when their landing craft struck mines in the first hour of the invasion. One of those serving on Juno Beach that day was a young Canadian officer named James Doohan, who would later go on to worldwide fame, portraying the iconic character of Scotty in the Star Trek TV series and movies. Doohan was a commissioned lieutenant with the 14th Field Artillery Regiment of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and on D-Day he was tasked with leading his men across a field littered with anti-tank mines in order to capture a German position, with Doohan killing 2 German snipers in the process. At around 1120 hours, during a lull in the fighting, he stopped to smoke a cigarette before making his way back to his men, when a terrified Canadian machine gunner opened up fire on him, believing him to be a German. He was shot 6 times, 4 in the leg, 1 in the chest, and 1 which took off his right middle finger. In a classic tale of luck in wartime, his life was saved by the metal cigarette tin he carried in his chest pocket, which absorbed the shot aimed at his chest, which almost certainly would have killed him. Later in life, while filming Star Trek, efforts had to be made to disguise the finger he lost on D-Day, with a hand double used for close-up shots that were required. Sword was the easternmost beach on D-Day, and prior to the war was a popular tourist destination, with numerous summer houses dotting the coastline. Many of these houses had been destroyed by the German defenders to improve their field of fire, while others had been reinforced and turned into makeshift bunkers, with an anti-tank ditch being dug behind the sea wall. The beach was also defended by 2 field gun positions, with 75mm guns based at Merville and harder-hitting 155mm guns at Le Havre, and these received special attention from Allied aircraft and paratroopers to prevent them from interfering in the landings. Beginning at 725 hours, when the tide was right, Sword was assaulted by the British Army's 3rd Division, supported by the 27th Armoured Brigade and contingents of British and Free French commandos. The primary objective of the forces landing on Sword Beach was to capture a series of important bridges 3.5 miles inland, on the River Orne and the Caen Canal. These bridges were being held by British airborne forces, while the commandos had to fight their way west to link up with Canadian forces from Juno Beach. However, having landed on the beaches, further advancement was slow going, thanks in part to the heavy congestion of Allied forces squashed into the narrow streets and side roads of the French coastal towns, and fierce German resistance from the town of Ouistreham. Through the day, it became apparent that any hope of linking with the Canadians before nightfall had been dashed when, to the British's horror, they found themselves under attack by the 21st Panzer Division. These skilled German panzer crews made powerful attacks on the British, including the men holding the bridge on the River Orne and helping to block them from linking with the Canadians at Juno, but their effectiveness was hampered by disruptions to their chain of command and overwhelming air power pitted against them. As Allied gliders landed nearby their positions in late evening, the panzer crews feared they were being overrun. They retreated, unaware that the gliders had actually missed their designated landing zones and had landed there purely by mistake. At sea, 3 German E-boats of the 5th Torpedo Squadron slipped from their moorings and dashed out to attack the many Allied vessels supporting the landing, perhaps hoping to repeat the carnage they inflicted during Operation Tiger. The E-boats arrived off Sword Beach to find the scene largely obscured by a smokescreen, forcing them in closer. Emerging from the smoke, they were confronted by the awe-inspiring sight of hundreds of Allied vessels, ranging from small landing craft to enormous battleships. They dispatched 18 torpedoes into the Allied force, but only succeeded in sinking a free Norwegian destroyer, the Svena, before being forced to retreat. This was the end of German naval interference on D-Day, as Allied air power was so overwhelming that to put any warships or U-boats to sea in daylight was practically suicidal. However, German sailors did continue the fight by manning coastal guns alongside their Wehrmacht comrades. As for Germany's air force, a handful of sorties were ordered against the ships supporting the landings and the beaches, the most notable encounter perhaps being when two Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters swooped down and strafed British troops at Sword Beach. Two-engined Stuka dive bombers also made desperate daylight attacks, but were savaged by Allied fighters at almost every step of the way. During the day, 28,500 men crossed Sword Beach, but in the hard-fought campaign to capture it, they sustained 683 casualties. The British and French forces would finally link up with the Canadians from Juneau the next day. Yet, despite the horrors the troops were seeing, many of them just young men barely beginning their adult lives, it seems the old carry-on spirit had not been a casualty that day. As David Teacher, a member of the RAF 71 Beach Unit, said afterwards, Slowly we overcame all the nightmares. There was no lack of humour. A soldier coming ashore asked, "Is this a private beach?" I was promised a private beach. If not, I am not staying. And we heard, "My mother told me not to travel by air. She thought it was much safer by sea." The initial German response to D-Day was one of confusion as to what to do. Germany's rigid command structure relied heavily on orders from the Führer, but of course he was still asleep as the Allies landed on the beaches. The picture was still somewhat confused to German high command, and having laboured for so long on the belief that any landing away from Calais was a decoy, they argued over whether or not to wake Hitler until they knew more as to what was actually taking place. It wouldn't be until approximately 10 AM, with the arrival of Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, that Hitler was finally awoken. According to the author and historian Stephen Ambrose, who penned the epic book Band of Brothers, Hitler's response was rather unexpected, uttering the words, "The news couldn't be better." Goebbels too noted that the news of the invasion seemed to come as a relief to him, as though they could finally get on with the war in the West. Hitler was both supremely confident of his men in Normandy holding off the Allies, and stuck to his belief that Calais was where the real invasion would come over the next few days. Now the German high command was awake, Hitler began to organize his response. One of his first acts was to reluctantly release 2 reserve panzer divisions near Paris to be sent to Normandy. However, he was told that Allied air power over Normandy and the surrounding areas was so intense that they would have to wait until nightfall to move, lest they be destroyed on the roads by Allied fighter bombers. This crucial delay worked in favour of the Allies, who, by nightfall, were already pushing beyond the beaches. Incredibly, despite the enormity of what was happening in Normandy, Hitler still took time in the afternoon to attend a reception for the new Austrian foreign minister in Salzburg, perhaps hinting that he failed to fully grasp the reality of what was happening in France. As darkness fell in the final hours of June 6th, the German U-boats finally ventured out to sea in an effort to disrupt the landing operations. Even with the cover of darkness, the fear of air attack was still there, as Allied warplanes were now using radar to detect them on the surface. However, they did not arrive until the daylight hours of June 7th, allowing Allied air and sea power to swoop in, attacking them as they recharged their batteries on the surface. 2 U-boats were sunk and 4 more heavily damaged, forcing the German Navy to abandon any attack with U-boats not yet fitted with snorkels that could allow them to run their diesel engines while submerged. The only U-boats with snorkels were based in the south, in the Bay of Biscay, and in the north of Norway, to better allow them to attack convoys from the United States. And it would take them until mid-June to break through the dense Allied anti-submarine forces arranged against them, by which time the invasion force was dug in and breaking out into France. German resistance remained strong around the beachheads of Normandy for days afterwards, and even as the Allied troops began to move out, pockets of German resistance remained, even as they became encircled by the Allied invasion force. One German unit manning a bunker situated between Sword and Juneau beaches, which housed a radar installation, held out for a staggering 12 days after D-Day, despite having found themselves well behind Allied lines at that point. After establishing their beachhead, over the summer the Allied force would grow and become more powerful. Eventually it would burst outward and charge across Europe, pushing Hitler's army back as Nazi Germany was choked to death by the Allied onslaught. 11 months and 1 day after D-Day, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. Looking back on June 6th and the days that followed, we tend to take for granted the success of the D-Day landings. They are remembered in the West, particularly in the United States, United Kingdom and Canada, as amongst the most glorious of days when the greatest generation rose to the challenge. Sadly, like many battles throughout history, D-Day has become romanticized in such a way as to overlook the horrific reality of what took place. It's easy to quote casualty figures as a way of measuring the cost of what truly happened, but the battle for Normandy no doubt damaged the lives of hundreds of thousands who, while they survived, had to live with the memories of the horror they saw, and perhaps it is really for them that when we celebrate their victory every year on June 6th, we recognize the price they paid for freedom in Europe. It is because we enjoy such freedoms now in the 21st century afforded to us by those incredible soldiers that probably more than any other military operation in history, D-Day has left us pondering many questions that begin with the words "what if?" What if German naval forces had repeated their success during Operation Tiger on the landing ships? What if Eisenhower had ignored Stagg's recommendation to delay, and the D-Day landings went ahead amidst the bad weather of June 5th? What if Hitler had listened to Rommel and placed tanks closer to the beaches prior to D-Day? What if, for any one of a million reasons, D-Day failed? What then? Atomic bombs dropped in Europe, perhaps? Or maybe a Europe that would end the war fully under the control of the Soviet Empire? Thankfully, these what-ifs and many more will always remain simply questions for debate, thanks to the success of June 6th, 1944, Operation Overlord.
Hey you, don't miss out our next video. Hit that subscribe button for exclusive videos and join our awesome community and enjoy. Subscribe now!